6 months ago, if you'd told me I would be standing on the edge of a 200-foot private pier, staring out across the calm water of a harbor instead of hunched over screens managing cryptocurrency assets, I would have laughed in disbelief. That life, the one filled with virtual transactions, blockchain algorithms, and fluctuating Bitcoin prices, had consumed me for nearly a decade. It wasn't that I hadn't loved the hustle, the rush of watching my mining operations expand from the ground up, but after I made my first $1 million, then $5 million, then $20 million, I found myself questioning the value of it all. The money was good, no doubt, but it came with a price. I spent the majority of my waking hours staring at a computer screen, dealing with constant stress, constantly monitoring the market, the price fluctuations, and managing an operation that existed only in cyberspace. It was isolating. Every day bled into the next, with little to show beyond the numbers on my accounts. The more I thought about it, the more it became clear that I was exhausted, not just physically but emotionally. I craved something more tangible. I needed a break, a reset. So, I sold off everything, the servers, the mining contracts, all the equipment that I had meticulously built over the years. The sale of my entire operation netted me around $47 million. It felt like a lifetime of work coming to a sudden and final end. The decision was liberating, but it left me with an empty space. What do you do when you have financial freedom, but no real connection to anything meaningful? That's when the idea hit me, buy something real. Something I could touch, something that would ground me again. I didn't need luxury. I didn't need another investment that was just going to sit there and appreciate in value. I needed peace, solitude, and a place where I could truly be away from the world. I started looking for homes, and that's when I found the listing. The property was a small waterfront cabin. Modest. Not what most people would call extravagant. The price was just under $900,000, which, given the location, seemed reasonable. But what intrigued me wasn't the cabin itself. It was the note in the property description that mentioned existing maritime commercial agreements and riparian rights attached to the deed. Most people would have skimmed over that, dismissing it as legal jargon. But I was wired differently after years of reading through complex cryptocurrency contracts. If something felt overly technical, it often meant there was something important buried in the details. I needed to know more. The idea of owning waterfront property with rights to the water and the business potential that might come with it had the spark of something far more exciting than I could have imagined. I called the listing agent and arranged a meeting with the seller. I had no idea what I was walking into, but I was curious. The seller, Mrs. Peton, an elderly widow, had been struggling to manage her late husband's estate. I met her at the property on a chilly autumn afternoon. She was a sweet woman, but clearly overwhelmed by the mountains of paperwork and business dealings she had inherited. As we toured the cabin, I could sense her discomfort with the maritime side of the property. She handed me a massive ring of boat keys, at least 30 different keys, each varying in size and shape, like they were part of an ancient treasure chest. She seemed unsure of their significance. "These might be important," she said with a sigh, "but I never figured out what they all open." Harold was always down at the docks, talking to captains, signing papers, but I stayed focused on the house and the garden. I didn't need any more convincing. As we walked toward the pier, I saw it. This was no ordinary residential dock. The infrastructure was far beyond what you'd expect for a recreational property. There were commercial-grade cleats for mooring large vessels, industrial-strength electrical hookups meant for serious power loads, and fuel lines running underground, making it clear that this was not just a private dock for a weekend fishing boat. I could already feel the weight of it, the history, the potential. This wasn't a simple retreat. This was a piece of property that came with an entire maritime operation. As we approached the end of the pier, I looked out across the water at the bustling harbor. The commercial fishing boats heading out for their early morning runs, the luxury yachts preparing for weekend charters. It was obvious that this wasn't just a quiet corner of the world, this was a working harbor. The business potential here was palpable. When I asked Mrs. Peton about it, she shrugged helplessly. Harold always said the water business was complicated. He told me to leave it to the men who understood such things. It was then that I realized just how little she knew about her husband's business. It was all so much larger than she had realized. Harold Peton hadn't just owned a waterfront cabin. He had owned a marina operation, complete with fuel sales, commercial boat slips, and agreements with fishing fleets and yacht charters. This wasn't a small residential property at all. This was a commercial operation with ongoing contracts and revenue streams that I had inherited. That was when I decided to make an offer. I called Mrs. Peton a few days later and told her I was interested. She seemed relieved, almost too relieved. I think she was grateful to have someone who seemed willing to take the whole thing off her hands. The closing went smoothly, and I made the deal. I had just spent $900,000 on a modest cabin, but I had inherited an entire maritime empire without even realizing it. I knew I needed time to figure out what I had actually purchased, but I was willing to dive in. It felt right. The weight of it, the complexity of the situation, was exactly what I had been craving. Something real. Something tangible. The cabin was my retreat, but what I had truly bought was so much more. It was going to take time to understand the full extent of what I now owned. As I moved into the property, I felt a strange mix of excitement and uncertainty. What had I actually bought? How did this all work? And what was I going to do with a marina operation? I had no idea yet. But as I sat on the pier that first evening, watching the sun dip behind the mountains, I realized that for the first time in years, I wasn't looking at numbers on a screen. I wasn't managing servers or checking the latest price fluctuations on Bitcoin. I was looking at the world in front of me, real boats, real businesses, and a community that was as real as it got. It was the perfect time for a new beginning. It was one of those crisp early autumn days when the air feels like it's been touched by the sea, fresh and salty, making you want to breathe deeply. I arrived at the property just as the morning fog was lifting, giving the place an almost mystical quality. The waterfront cabin stood modestly at the edge of the harbor, its weathered wood giving it the kind of character I had hoped to find when I started this search for something real. The cabin was nothing special, certainly not a luxury mansion, but there was something about the land, the pier, and the vast expanse of water beyond it that had drawn me in. I wasn't looking for a trophy property, I wasn't after an investment. I wanted peace. This place, with its mix of simplicity and potential, felt like it could give me exactly that. Mrs. Peton was already waiting for me when I stepped out of the car. She looked every bit the part of the grieving widow, her frail body wrapped in a heavy shawl that seemed to swallow her tiny frame. I could tell from the moment we met that she was overwhelmed, out of her depth with all the paperwork and complicated affairs her late husband had left behind. She greeted me with a warm, tired smile, and we made small talk as we walked toward the cabin. I noticed her nervous glances at the surrounding grounds, as though she had never really settled into the world her husband had built around her. For her, the cabin, the land, and the pier were all just pieces of an estate she didn't fully understand or manage. For me, they were clues that I didn't yet fully grasp, but clues nonetheless. As we stepped inside, Mrs. Peton's voice was soft, almost apologetic. She admitted that she wasn't sure about much of the property's maritime side. My Harold was always so busy with the docks, she said, almost like an afterthought. He used to spend hours there, with captains and fishermen, making deals. I just stayed in the house, took care of the garden, and let him handle the rest. The more she spoke, the clearer it became. She had been far removed from the business side of things. She didn't understand the significance of the equipment on the pier or the keys she had handed me earlier, keys that now seemed to unlock doors to an operation much larger than a simple private dock. I could feel the weight of the room shifting as I asked her about the pier and the area around it. Mrs. Peton's answers were vague, her memories fogged by time and the complexity of her late husband's business. She seemed uncomfortable talking about anything related to the marina. As we made our way toward the back of the property, she handed me a large, bulging ring of keys. "These might be important," she said, the words coming out slowly, as though she weren't sure herself. "I never really knew what they opened. Harold was always in charge of that part. I'm sorry I can't be more helpful." The keys clinked together as I took them, their significance not lost on me. These weren't just keys to doors or sheds. They were keys to a maritime operation, one that had been running long before I showed up. We walked down to the pier, and it was there, standing at the end of the dock, that I began to get the full sense of the place. The pier extended far beyond the typical reach for a residential property, nearly 200 feet into the harbor. But it wasn't just the size of it that caught my attention. It was the way it was built. The dock was solid, industrial-grade cleats for mooring large vessels, reinforced beams that could withstand heavy weather, and electrical hookups that were far more robust than any recreational boat would need. My mind began to race. This wasn't just a spot for fishing or weekend boat rides. This was a commercial-grade marina, a facility built to handle serious traffic, and it was all on the property I had just purchased. Looking out across the harbor, I could see the commercial boats coming in and out, their motors cutting through the water like clockwork. It was clear that this harbor was more than a simple marina. It was a hub for the local fishing fleet. I could see large fishing boats heading out into the open water, and luxury yachts preparing for charter trips. The marina wasn't just a place for private boats, it was an active, working business. A business that Mrs. Peton seemed to barely understand, let alone manage. Her husband, Harold, had been the one who orchestrated all of it, and now I was standing in his place, trying to make sense of what he had built. I glanced over at Mrs. Peton, who stood beside me with a distant look in her eyes, her mind clearly somewhere else. It wasn't that she was uninterested in the property, it was simply that she had never been a part of its heart, the business side of it. She seemed to accept that this was Harold's domain and that it was beyond her to understand it fully. She continued to mumble about the house and the garden, completely unaware of the value and complexity of the operation her late husband had created. Harold always told me that the water business was complicated, she said, almost as though trying to explain her own lack of involvement. He always said I should leave it to the men who understood such things. Her words stuck with me. I couldn't help but notice the casual way she dismissed something that seemed so important. This wasn't just a property with a small dock. This was an active, multifaceted business that required knowledge and expertise to navigate. And yet here I was, standing at the center of it, learning that everything I thought I had bought was just a small part of a much bigger operation. My gut told me that this was no ordinary real estate deal. Mrs. Peton, for all her kindness and her desire to move on, hadn't understood the full scope of what her husband had been running here. And now, I was left with keys, both literal and metaphorical, to a business I hadn't yet begun to understand. The weight of the situation hit me fully as we walked back toward the cabin. I had come here looking for peace and simplicity, but instead, I had stumbled upon a business that had been running for decades, with intricate contracts, commercial licenses, and ongoing operations that spanned far beyond the waterfront cabin I thought I was buying. At that moment, I realized that this property was no longer just about the house. It was about the marina, the fuel services, the contracts with the Coast Guard, and the businesses that relied on it. In a way, it was about inheriting Harold Peton's legacy, a legacy of hard work, business savvy, and maritime knowledge that I would now have to step into and figure out. As I left the property that day, I felt a mix of excitement and uncertainty. What had I really bought? I had come looking for a quiet retreat, but what I had walked away with was a maritime operation that had the potential to be worth far more than the $900,000 I'd spent. Mrs. Peton had handed me the keys, not just to her property, but to a long-standing business, one that I was now responsible for. I knew it was going to take time to process everything, to figure out what I had inherited, and to determine whether this was a mistake or an unexpected opportunity. But for the first time in years, I wasn't worrying about cryptocurrency or server farms. I was standing at the edge of a real world, a world of docks, boats, and business relationships that had been built long before I arrived. It had been 3 weeks since I closed on the property. The moving truck had come and gone, the boxes unpacked, and the minimal possessions I owned were now settled into the simple waterfront cabin. The first few days felt like a dream. I would wake up early, walk down to the pier, and sit there watching the harbor come to life. It was everything I'd been craving: peace, simplicity, the rhythm of the water, and the sense of being connected to something real. No more digital screens, no more transactions, no more fluctuations in the market that determined my worth from one minute to the next. I could feel the weight lifting off my shoulders, and I thought maybe, just maybe, I had found the kind of life I was searching for. That Saturday morning, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting golden light over the water. The air was crisp, the kind of morning that made you feel like the world was starting fresh. I was standing at the end of the pier, inhaling deeply and taking in the beauty of the place when I saw them. At first, I didn't think much of it. People walked down the waterfront path all the time, but then I noticed the way they were walking toward my property, purposeful, determined, almost like they had a mission. And when I recognized the woman leading them, I felt the first ripple of unease. She was dressed in what I later came to understand was maritime chic, the kind of clothing that says, I'm rich enough to buy a yacht but don't actually know how to sail one. A perfectly tailored jacket, a scarf that looked like it belonged in a catalog, and shoes that had seen far too many manicured lawns and not nearly enough docks. Her posture screamed authority, the way someone walks when they expect to be in charge. And judging by her stiff, confident stride, she was on a mission. She was tall, mid-40s, with sharp features that seemed designed to intimidate. This was no casual neighbor. This was a woman who walked through life like she owned it, and in her mind, I had a feeling my little pier was not part of her world. As they approached, I stood still for a moment, uncertain of their intentions. It wasn't until they reached the base of the pier that she spoke. "I'm Serafina Westmont," she announced, without any preamble, president of the Coastal Haven Homeowners Association. "We need to discuss your immediate compliance with our community's maritime standards." She said it in the tone of someone who was used to being obeyed, without a single trace of curiosity or politeness in her voice. I stood there, staring at her for a moment, unsure of what had just happened. The words she'd spoken didn't quite register. Maritime standards? What the hell was she talking about? I had only been here for 3 weeks, and this was the first time anyone from the HOA had approached me. In fact, I was fairly certain that my property wasn't even subject to HOA regulations. I had done my homework before I closed. The deed was clear, no HOA restrictions, no covenants that could be enforced. This was supposed to be my private retreat, my escape. Yet here she was, with 2 other board members in tow, standing at the end of my pier like they had some right to dictate what I could or couldn't do with my property. The 2 people with her didn't even introduce themselves. One was an older man, probably in his 60s, who kept nervously glancing at his phone, looking like he was trying to avoid eye contact. The other was a woman, probably about the same age as Serafina, who had a camera slung around her neck. She was snapping photos of my pier, the boats, and even the view across the harbor. Her intensity was unsettling, and I could feel her eyes moving over every detail of the dock as if she was preparing some kind of dossier on me. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice calm, and introduced myself. "I'm Dash Kensington, and this is my property. I just closed on it 3 weeks ago, so I'm not sure what standards you're referring to, but I'm happy to discuss any legitimate concerns you might have." I tried to keep the conversation civil. I was new to this place, and I didn't want to start any trouble. But Serafina's response made it clear that any attempt to approach this diplomatically was already too late. Her expression hardened as she gestured toward the pier, her tone becoming more condescending. "This primitive fishing setup is completely incompatible with our community's vision of waterfront excellence," she said, her nose wrinkling as she took in my small, modest fishing boat, an old 24-foot vessel I'd bought to do some recreational crab trapping and to get a better feel for the local maritime life. The boat was certainly nothing extravagant, just a simple means of getting out on the water, but to Serafina, it was an eyesore. She continued, her words growing more hostile as she took in the rest of the pier. "This setup is a violation of our community's aesthetic guidelines for residential waterfront properties. The presence of industrial-grade equipment creates an unsightly disruption to the carefully maintained ambience our community has worked years to establish." She looked at me with disdain, as if my very presence was a stain on the pristine landscape they had envisioned when they moved here. I felt the tension in my chest begin to rise. I didn't understand what she was talking about. Industrial-grade equipment? I had some basic crab traps and a modest boat. Sure, the pier was older, but it was structurally sound. There was nothing about it that should have raised any red flags, at least not in the way she was presenting it. I tried to keep my cool, though. I had learned long ago that arguing didn't get you anywhere, especially when you were dealing with people like Serafina. "I'm not planning to run a commercial business from this property," I said, my voice steady. "This is just personal equipment for my own recreational use. It's not intended for anything more than that." Serafina didn't even acknowledge what I said. Instead, she glanced over at the man holding the phone and nodded for him to speak. He cleared his throat and spoke with an air of officiousness, reading from what looked like a legal document. "According to Section 4.7 of our community's maritime regulations, any waterfront property owner engaged in commercial fishing activities must obtain prior approval from the Architectural Review Committee and demonstrate compliance with established aesthetic standards." He paused, looking up at me, clearly waiting for a reaction. I felt like I had stepped into a strange, surreal situation. This was getting out of hand. I knew that wasn't true. I had checked the deed carefully, and I had made sure that the property wasn't bound by HOA restrictions. It was one of the main reasons I had chosen this place. It offered freedom from the kind of bureaucratic overreach that so many people warned me about. But instead of getting angry or frustrated, I decided to stay calm and approach this with logic. I didn't want to escalate things unnecessarily. I think there's been some confusion, I said, trying to sound reasonable. I bought this place because it wasn't subject to HOA restrictions. I don't intend to run a commercial fishing operation, and I'm not doing anything that violates any laws or agreements. Serafina's face hardened. Personal recreation that disrupts community standards is still a violation of our neighborhood character preservation requirements, she said flatly. You have 72 hours to dismantle this pier and remove all fishing-related equipment. If you don't comply, we will pursue legal remedies. Her words were final, as if there was no room for discussion. The audacity of her demand took me by surprise. I had just spent nearly $1 million on this property, and now she was telling me I had to tear it down? The property wasn't even subject to HOA oversight. Yet, there they were, 3 people who had never seen me before, trying to dictate how I could use my land. But before I could respond, the sound of a deep horn blasted from the distance. It was the kind of sound that echoed across the water, and as I turned, I saw a massive fishing boat, probably 80 feet long, heading out of the harbor. The name painted on its hull was Sea Titan. The captain waved as they passed by, a gesture that seemed both polite and familiar, as if we had known each other for years. It was then that Serafina turned to look at me, her face twisting with frustration. See exactly what I'm talking about, she said. Your little hobby operation is encouraging disruptive maritime traffic right through our residential area. I stared at her in disbelief. She was suggesting that I had control over commercial fishing boats that had been operating in the harbor for decades? It was absurd. But it was clear that she wasn't interested in hearing any of it. She had already made up her mind about what should happen, and there was no room for discussion. The air between us grew thick with tension as Serafina stood there, her hands on her hips, eyeing the pier with something approaching disdain. She wasn't the kind of person who entertained ambiguity. There was no room for negotiation in her world, no space for questions or doubts. As I stood there, trying to make sense of the escalating situation, I could feel the weight of her words settling on me. You have 72 hours to dismantle this pier and remove all fishing-related equipment, she repeated, her tone colder now, as if she had already won. The finality in her voice made it clear. In her mind, this wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. For a moment, I stood there in disbelief. 72 hours? To dismantle my pier? A pier that I had inherited with the property, a pier that wasn't just a simple dock, but a part of a long-standing, functional infrastructure that had been in place for years. And yet, here she was, telling me to tear it down as if it was some eyesore that didn't belong. My mind raced, trying to process what was happening. I had spent $900,000 on this property, and now, less than a month into living here, I was being told I couldn't use my pier? The absurdity of it all made my stomach churn. Serafina didn't seem to care about the reality of the situation. She was on a mission, one that, in her mind, was justified by the aesthetic standards of the neighborhood. You're disrupting the carefully curated community we've built here, she continued, her voice dripping with a kind of authoritative smugness. I could tell she had said these words 100 times before, probably with a string of other newcomers who hadn't dared to stand up to her. She clearly thought she could steamroll me the same way she had with others. But this time, I wasn't backing down. Not now. Not when I was finally starting to grasp the full weight of what I had inherited. I took a breath and squared my shoulders, trying to keep my voice even despite the rising frustration in my chest. Serafina, with all due respect, I don't think you understand, I said, trying to keep my tone calm, though I could feel the edge creeping into my words. I didn't buy this place to disrupt anything. I bought it because it wasn't subject to any HOA restrictions, and because it's a part of a much larger operation, a marina, that I'm now responsible for. My words hung in the air between us. I wasn't sure if she even fully understood what I was saying, but at this point, I felt like I had to make her see reason, or at least make it clear that I wasn't going to be intimidated. Her expression didn't change, but there was a slight tightening around her jaw that suggested she wasn't happy with my pushback. "It doesn't matter what you thought you bought," she snapped, a flash of anger breaking through her composed exterior. "You're still violating the rules, and unless you remove your pier and all associated equipment, we will pursue legal remedies." She didn't pause, didn't give me a chance to respond before turning to the nervous man who had been standing in the background, tapping away on his phone. "Gregory," she said sharply, "can you pull up the bylaws on this? Let's show Mr. Kensington just how serious we are." Gregory, who had looked as though he wanted to be anywhere but here, fumbled with his phone before presenting a legal document on a bright white screen. It was hard to take him seriously when he looked so out of place in this confrontation, but I understood what he was doing. This wasn't about rules, it was about establishing dominance. Serafina wanted to remind me that, even if I wasn't technically under HOA control, she could still make my life miserable with the right legal threats. The document he presented contained citations from the community's maritime regulations, citing Section 4.7, the section that supposedly governed commercial fishing and the need for HOA approval to engage in any disruptive maritime activities. Of course, this had nothing to do with me. I wasn't running a commercial business. I wasn't violating any laws. But in Serafina's mind, she had already won. "According to this," Gregory said in a tone that suggested he was reading from a script, "the presence of any commercial fishing activity must be pre-approved by the Architectural Review Committee, and your equipment is clearly against the neighborhood's character standards." Serafina nodded, her sharp eyes never leaving me, waiting for my reaction. I could feel my blood pressure rising. How could they seriously be trying to enforce this? The absurdity of the situation was beyond belief. They were trying to claim that I couldn't even use my own property without their approval, that my small fishing boat and modest pier, which I had inherited as part of my purchase, somehow violated their community's vision. It was clear that this was no longer about aesthetics, it was about control. I could feel the anger building inside me, but I knew I had to stay calm. I couldn't let them see me rattle. "I'm not going to dismantle the pier," I said, keeping my voice firm. "This is my property, and I'm not breaking any laws. I've already checked with my lawyer, and I'm not bound by your HOA's restrictions. I don't need permission to use my pier, and I'm certainly not going to remove it based on your aesthetic guidelines." Serafina's face hardened, but she didn't back down. "You don't have a choice," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "If you refuse to comply, we will pursue legal remedies. The HOA has the support of the community, and we won't hesitate to take action against someone who is disrupting the harmony we've worked so hard to maintain." It was then that I realized how deep this was going to go. This wasn't just about the pier. This wasn't about some arbitrary HOA rule about aesthetics. This was about power. Serafina and the board members weren't just trying to get me to follow some community standards. They were trying to impose their will on me, trying to make me bend to their vision of how this place should be. The fact that they were willing to threaten legal action so quickly made it clear to me they were accustomed to getting their way. But they hadn't counted on me. I could feel my resolve hardening. This wasn't just some petty disagreement anymore. It was a fight for control of my property and my future here. I wasn't going to let them push me around. I had the resources to fight back, and now I was going to find out exactly where the HOA's power ended and where mine began. Serafina and her team were preparing to leave, but she turned one last time to deliver her final message. "We have standards here at Coastal Haven," she said with an icy smile. "And we protect them vigorously. I suggest you use the next 72 hours wisely, Mr. Kensington. I'm sure you wouldn't want to make a mistake that you'll regret." As they turned to leave, I stood there, watching them go. The tension in the air was thick, and I could feel my chest tightening. But as I looked out across the harbor, something clicked. I wasn't just dealing with some HOA rules. I was up against an entrenched system that had lived comfortably in its own little bubble. And now, for the first time, it was facing someone who wasn't going to let it slide. I wasn't going to back down, not this time. The day after Serafina's ultimatum, I found myself standing on the pier again, watching the water ripple beneath the early morning light. It had been a restless night. I couldn't stop thinking about the threats she had made, the impossible demands to dismantle my pier and remove my fishing gear. In my mind, it was absurd. This was my property, my retreat from the world of digital chaos I had left behind. And now, just a few weeks into owning it, I was being told how I could use it by a group of people who seemed completely unaware of what they were doing. It wasn't just about the pier anymore. It wasn't even about whether or not I wanted to keep the fishing equipment. No, it was about control. Serafina and her board members were attempting to dictate the terms of my life here, and I wasn't about to let them. I spent the morning walking the property, thinking. I needed to understand exactly what I had gotten myself into. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a small HOA overstepping its bounds. This was a larger issue, an issue involving not only my personal rights as a property owner, but also a business operation that was at the heart of this harbor community. Mrs. Peton, the seller, had handed me the keys to something far more complex than a cabin by the water. The marina, the fuel concessions, the commercial boat slips, they weren't just extras that came with the land. They were part of a thriving business that had been running here for decades. And it was that realization that sent me to the phone. I needed answers. Not just from a lawyer, but from someone who knew this world, the world of maritime law and the intricacies of waterfront property rights. That's when I called my brother, Caspian. Caspian had been practicing maritime law for years in Seattle. He specialized in disputes involving waterfront properties and had dealt with more than his fair share of cases where businesses and residential communities collided over land use. I had no idea what I was walking into, but I knew I needed someone who could give me the facts, someone who could help me understand just what had been transferred to me when I bought this place. When I explained the situation to Caspian, he didn't seem surprised. He had probably dealt with something similar before. He said, his voice calm but certain, it sounds like a classic case of HOA overreach. But you might be missing something more important. Waterfront properties come with a whole host of rights and responsibilities, and they're not always clear in the title. You need to get a comprehensive title search, and you need to figure out what maritime rights come with this place. His words hit me like a ton of bricks. Maritime rights, that was the key. It wasn't just about the pier or the equipment on it. It was about the business side of things. Harold Peton hadn't just owned a cabin. He had been running a marina operation that involved commercial licenses, fuel contracts, and partnerships with the Coast Guard. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how little I actually understood about what I had inherited. Caspian's advice was exactly what I needed to hear. I needed to know what I had really bought, what was legally mine, and what might be part of a broader, more complicated network of business deals that involved more than just me. He suggested I contact someone he knew who specialized in maritime property law, Victoria Sterling. Victoria had handled cases in the Pacific Northwest, and she was known for digging into the kind of complex legal issues I was dealing with. I felt a sense of urgency growing in my chest as I realized just how much I needed to know. Serafina and her HOA weren't just causing problems for me, they were threatening an operation that predated them, and I needed to understand exactly where my rights started and ended. That afternoon, I called Victoria Sterling's office. She was available to speak with me almost immediately, which struck me as both reassuring and alarming. I explained the situation, giving her the details about the property, the marina, and the HOA's threats. After a long silence on the other end of the phone, she spoke. "You've stumbled into something much more significant than you think," she said, her voice low and measured. The marina operation Harold Peton was running wasn't just a small business, it was a central part of the harbor's infrastructure. If your property includes that business, and if the rights to operate it were transferred to you when you bought the place, then the HOA doesn't have any authority to dictate how you use it. Her words hit me like a floodgate opening. I had inherited something far more valuable than I realized. The property wasn't just a retreat, it was a business operation worth millions. Harold had set up agreements with the local fishing fleets, luxury yachts, fuel stations, and even the Coast Guard. He had built a small but thriving maritime business, and it wasn't just something that could be torn down with a simple legal demand from an HOA president. This was real, and if the HOA didn't understand that, they were about to learn the hard way. I hung up the phone with Victoria feeling more certain than ever that I wasn't going to let Serafina or her board push me around. I had been trying to take the high road, trying to approach this situation calmly and diplomatically, but that had been a mistake. They weren't interested in diplomacy. They were playing a power game, trying to bully me into submission. I wasn't going to stand for it. Now, with Victoria's legal expertise, I had a plan. I wasn't just going to protect my property, I was going to fight back. That night, I couldn't sleep. I was too wrapped up in everything I had learned over the course of the day. I had spent so many years dealing with virtual currencies and digital assets, but this was different. This was a business grounded in something real, something tangible. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the marina business wasn't just about boats and piers, it was about a community. People relied on it. They depended on it. The local economy depended on it. And now, here was Serafina, a woman who had no idea what she was dealing with, threatening all of that because she didn't like the aesthetic of my fishing boat. But it wasn't just about her trying to push me around. This was about something bigger. It was about understanding the legacy Harold Peton had left behind and the responsibilities that came with it. I wasn't just an outsider here. I was now a business owner with ties to the local community. And if the HOA didn't like that, I was ready to show them exactly what kind of business I had inherited. It was time to get serious. The next step was clear. I was going to find out exactly what rights I had and make sure that Serafina understood that her threats were nothing more than a bluff. The next few days were a blur. After my conversation with Caspian and Victoria, I knew I had to act quickly. The stakes were higher than I had initially realized, and Serafina and the HOA weren't going to back down just because I had asked them to. They were playing a game of power, and I wasn't about to let them dictate the terms of my life here. The first step was clear. I had to get a complete picture of the property I had inherited, especially the maritime rights that came with it. If I wanted to challenge the HOA's threats, I needed to understand exactly what I had legally, not just what I thought I owned. I started with the title search. I had my lawyer pull all the documents related to the property, everything that had been filed in the county and any legal descriptions tied to the land, the pier, and the marina operations. As I sat in the small office of my cabin, I spread out the paperwork across the dining table, looking at the deeds, contracts, and the fine print that I had skimmed over when I first made the purchase. The more I read, the more I understood. What I had thought was a quiet waterfront retreat was actually a fully operational marina. It wasn't just the pier and the fishing boat. It was the licenses, the fuel concessions, the commercial agreements that had been in place for years. These weren't small-time operations either. They were crucial to the local economy. I had inherited not just a piece of property, but a business that catered to commercial fishermen, yacht charters, and other maritime ventures. And those maritime rights, the rights to the water, the docks, and the commercial use of the harbor, were tied to my land. This wasn't a casual piece of real estate. It was a business operation that extended far beyond the cabin itself. As I pored over the documents, I began to realize that Serafina and her board members had no idea what they were dealing with. Their threats were not only legally unfounded, they were dangerously ignorant. The pier wasn't just a residential asset, it was a commercial resource, and the legal rights associated with it extended into an intricate network of agreements with businesses, suppliers, and even government agencies like the Coast Guard. In that moment, I knew I had to act fast. The HOA's threats weren't just about controlling my personal equipment. They were an attempt to shut down an entire business operation that had been running for decades. But there was still so much I didn't understand. I needed to talk to someone who was an expert in maritime law, someone who could help me untangle the complexities of these rights and explain exactly how far my legal reach extended. That's when I called Victoria Sterling again. When Victoria picked up the phone, she sounded calm, almost as though she had been expecting my call. I've been going through the documents you sent me. I can tell you right now that you've inherited much more than just a cabin on the water. What Harold Peton built here was significant, not just a small marina, but a commercial operation that's central to the entire harbor. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. You're not just the owner of this property, You're sitting on a thriving maritime business. And Serafina has no legal authority to touch it. The clarity in her voice gave me a sense of relief, but it also brought a rush of adrenaline. I had something now, a legal position that could fight back against the HOA's claims. But it wasn't enough to just know that I was right. I needed to build my case, to prepare for the inevitable confrontation that was coming. And I knew that the HOA wasn't going to back down easily. They'd already made it clear that they wouldn't hesitate to take legal action if I didn't comply with their demands. But now, I had a lawyer with real expertise on my side, and I had the documents and maritime rights to back up my position. I spent the next few days combing through the property records and learning everything I could about Harold Peton's operation. The marina wasn't just an incidental part of the property. It was the economic engine of the entire harbor. The boat slips, fuel depots, and charter agreements were more than just features of the land. They were vital parts of a business that had contractual obligations and government licenses. Peton had built a relationship with the Coast Guard for training exercises, with local fishing cooperatives, and with charter services that had been using the marina for decades. The more I learned, the more I realized just how integrated this business was with the rest of the harbor's operations. It wasn't just a nice-to-have, it was essential to how things worked here. As I continued my research, I started talking to the people who worked in the marina, those who had been part of Harold's operation for years. They were the unsung backbone of the whole system. One of the first people I spoke to was Elena Rodriguez, the manager of the marina's fuel depot. She had worked there for nearly 20 years, and when I mentioned the threats from the HOA, she didn't seem surprised. "This happens every few years," she told me, shaking her head. "Some new person comes in, doesn't understand how things work, and suddenly we have to deal with these kinds of threats." Elena explained that the marina was the only fuel provider for much of the local fishing fleet, and that without the marina's fuel depot, the local economy would take a serious hit. That conversation opened my eyes even further. The marina wasn't just an isolated business, it was integrated into the entire community. The fishermen, the charter services, the Coast Guard, all of them depended on the infrastructure that had been built over the years. To tear it down, as Serafina was demanding, would not only disrupt my operations, it would impact the livelihoods of everyone who relied on the marina's services. The more I spoke with these people, the more I realized that they were on my side, even if they didn't know it yet. Harold Peton had built something special here, and now it was my job to ensure that it continued. By the time I called Victoria again, I felt more confident. "I'm ready to fight this," I told her. "I've got the documents, I've spoken to the people who depend on this operation, and I'm not going to let Serafina or anyone else shut it down. But I need to know exactly what my next step should be." Victoria didn't hesitate. "First, we need to get a full understanding of what maritime rights you hold. That includes the commercial licenses and any governmental agreements that might be in place. Once we have all that, we can start to map out a strategy. But I'll tell you one thing right now, this isn't just about protecting your property. This is about protecting an entire business and the people who rely on it." Her words were a punch of clarity. This wasn't just about defending a piece of land. This was about defending a community, a business, and a legacy that had been built over decades. I wasn't just a passive property owner. I was now a guardian of this operation, whether I was ready for it or not. But I wasn't going to let someone like Serafina tear it all down. I was ready for whatever came next. By Monday morning, I was already on edge. The previous few days had been a whirlwind of research and phone calls. I had spoken with Victoria Sterling, a maritime law expert, and pieced together the complexity of my situation. The documents I'd uncovered confirmed that I had inherited much more than just a simple waterfront cabin. The marina operation, which had been Harold Peton's pride and joy, wasn't just some extra feature of the property. It was a full-fledged business, vital to the local economy. Yet despite my newfound knowledge and confidence, the threat from Serafina and her HOA was hanging over me like a dark cloud, growing more intense by the hour. I knew the moment I had stood my ground with them, I was no longer dealing with some small neighborhood dispute. This was a full-scale battle over control of the harbor and my property. The phone rang as I was making coffee, its shrill sound cutting through the calm of the morning. I glanced at the caller ID. It was Serafina. I wasn't surprised, though I could feel my blood pressure rise just at the thought of talking to her. I took a deep breath and answered. "Mr. Kensington," her voice came through the line, dripping with the same condescending tone I had come to expect. "I'm calling to inform you that we've decided to expedite our enforcement timeline due to additional violations we observed over the weekend. You now have 24 hours to begin dismantling your pier and remove all fishing-related equipment, or we'll be filing for emergency injunctive relief." Her words were sharp, delivered with a sense of satisfaction that made my stomach twist. I didn't need her to spell it out. I knew exactly what she was trying to do. This wasn't about legal compliance or neighborhood standards. This was about intimidation, her attempt to force me into submission before I had the chance to get my legal team fully involved. She was hoping to break me before I could even mount a defense. 24 hours. I echoed, trying to keep my voice steady, though I could feel the anger rising. "Serafina, I have no idea what additional violations you're talking about." I've done nothing that would warrant this escalation. I spent most of the weekend meeting with local residents to learn more about the community, not engaging in commercial fishing activities. What changes are you seeing that justify shortening your timeline? There was a slight pause on the other end of the line before she responded, her voice now cold and dismissive. We have photographic evidence of you conducting unauthorized maritime business meetings throughout the weekend, clearly establishing commercial intent. This violates our community's zoning restrictions and is a clear violation of both HOA guidelines and county regulations. My heart sank. Photographic evidence? What the hell was she talking about? I had spent the weekend speaking with marina workers, boat captains, and other local business owners, getting a better understanding of the operation that I had inherited. But those conversations were just conversations, not meetings, certainly not business deals. They were simple exchanges to get a lay of the land, to understand the scope of what I had inherited. Yet here she was, twisting what was innocent into something sinister. I could almost feel her smugness seeping through the phone, as if she thought she had me cornered. I clenched my fist, but I didn't let her hear the tension in my voice. That's absurd, I said, my tone steady but firm. Those were conversations, not business meetings. I was researching my property, talking to people who have been working here for years. If you've interpreted that as something else, you're mistaken. Her response was icy, laced with the same arrogance that had defined every interaction we'd had so far. Your personal recreation is disrupting the community's character. Your actions are a direct violation of our neighborhood's character preservation requirements. We've given you ample time to comply, and your refusal to do so will only make things more difficult for you. You'll be facing legal action, Mr. Kensington. I let out a breath, pushing down the anger that was bubbling up inside of me. Serafina was doubling down. She wasn't interested in listening to reason. She wasn't interested in understanding the truth. She had already made up her mind that I was an enemy, and now it was clear, she was going to force me into compliance using whatever legal tactics she could. But I wasn't going to back down. Not this time. I'm not going to dismantle my pier, I said, my voice cutting through the tension. I'm not going to comply with demands based on false pretenses. This property is not subject to your HOA's rules, and I'm well within my rights to use it however I see fit. I suggest you consult with your legal team before you escalate this any further. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. For a moment, I thought she might argue further, but instead, her voice came back, dripping with barely contained frustration. Mr. Kensington, you clearly don't understand the gravity of the situation. The HOA has vigorously defended this community's integrity for years, and we're not about to let some outsider come in and destroy everything we've worked for. You'll regret testing our resolve. With that, she hung up. I stood there for a moment, the phone still pressed to my ear, her words echoing in my mind. Test their resolve? Was she kidding? Serafina was the one who didn't understand the situation. She thought she could bully me into submission, but she had no idea who she was dealing with. I wasn't just some newcomer who would bend to the whims of the HOA. I was the owner of a maritime business, a thriving operation that had been here for decades, serving the community and generating substantial revenue. And now, it was clear that Serafina's actions were more than just a nuisance. They were a threat to the livelihood of everyone who relied on this marina. I couldn't let her win. I called Victoria again. It's escalating. She's doubling down on her threats, and now she's accusing me of running a commercial operation that I'm not even involved in. She's trying to force me into compliance, using legal threats to get me to back down. Victoria's voice was steady and reassuring. You're doing the right thing by standing your ground. Serafina doesn't have the legal basis to make those demands, and her threats are nothing more than a bluff. We need to get ahead of this, document everything, and make sure you're prepared to fight back when they take the next step. She paused for a moment. I'll be in touch with my team, and we'll start putting together the legal framework to defend your rights. You're not alone in this. Hearing her words of reassurance gave me a momentary sense of relief, but I knew that this was just the beginning. Serafina wasn't going to back down, and neither was I. I was ready for whatever came next. I wasn't going to let her or the HOA intimidate me or take away what I had rightfully inherited. The battle was just beginning, and this time, I was ready to fight back. By the time the emergency HOA meeting was called, I knew things were about to get ugly. Serafina wasn't just trying to bully me out of my property, she was trying to make an example out of me. She was determined to use her position as HOA president to assert control, and she was convinced that her threats would force me to fold. But what she hadn't counted on was that I wasn't like the other homeowners who had just rolled over when the HOA stepped in. I wasn't going to sit quietly while she made up her own rules and imposed them on my life. I wasn't sure what I expected from the meeting, but when I arrived at the community center that evening, I realized how big this had become. The place was packed, with nearly every member of the HOA in attendance. Some of them sat at the long tables, others stood in the back, whispering among themselves. The air was thick with tension, as if the entire community was holding its breath. I could sense their curiosity, but there was something else there too: expectation. Serafina had framed me as the enemy, the outsider who was threatening the peaceful, affluent community they had worked so hard to cultivate. I could feel all their eyes on me, waiting for the showdown that Serafina had promised. Serafina was already standing at the front of the room, her posture straight and commanding. She exuded the kind of authority that made her seem untouchable. Beside her was the hired attorney she'd brought in, a man in a slick suit who looked more like a corporate fixer than someone who'd been hired to handle neighborhood disputes. He stood there quietly, flipping through some legal papers, trying to look like he was prepared to argue a case, but it was clear he was as much a pawn in this as I was. I took a seat in the back, waiting for my turn. The meeting started with Serafina laying out the charges against me. Her words were carefully chosen, dripping with the kind of righteous indignation that I had come to expect from her. She framed the entire situation as though I had come into their peaceful community with malicious intent, disrupting the harmony they had worked so hard to maintain. She spoke about the unsightly fishing equipment on my pier, the disruptive maritime traffic my activities had caused, and the damage to their precious aesthetic standards. The more she spoke, the clearer it became that this was not about the pier at all, it was about control. It was about someone who had spent too long at the top of the HOA ladder and had forgotten what it meant to be reasonable, to understand the realities of living in a community where not everyone shared the same vision. At the heart of her speech was the implication that my presence was somehow a threat to the entire neighborhood's existence, that my small fishing boat, which I used for personal recreation, was somehow bringing chaos to their perfect world. It was absurd. But I knew she had to frame me that way in front of the rest of the community to win their support. Divide and conquer, that was her strategy. She wanted the rest of the HOA members to see me as a threat, someone who was going to ruin their carefully curated paradise. As the meeting continued, I realized just how deep Serafina's grip on the community had been. She had spent years cultivating this sense of superiority, making everyone believe that they were better, that they deserved to have their rules followed without question. Now, she was using that same power to manipulate the situation and force me out. But the more I listened to her, the more it became clear to me that she had never really cared about the community itself. She cared about maintaining her own control. The community wasn't her priority. Her image was. When it was finally my turn to speak, I stood up slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The room fell silent. All eyes were on me. This was the moment I had been dreading. The moment where Serafina had painted me as the villain, and I had to find a way to show everyone the truth. But I wasn't going to beg for forgiveness or apologize. I wasn't here to explain myself to them. I was here to defend what was rightfully mine. And I wasn't going to back down. "Good evening," I started, keeping my voice calm and steady. "I'm Kensington. And contrary to what you've been led to believe, I didn't come here to destroy this community. I came here because I wanted something real, something peaceful, something that would allow me to step away from the world of digital chaos that I left behind. I bought this property, and I intend to enjoy it, just as every other property owner here is entitled to do." The room was still. I could feel the eyes on me, some skeptical, others curious. But I wasn't finished yet. "What you don't know," I continued, "is that this property is not just a cabin with a pier. It's an active, thriving marina operation, a business that has been running for decades. And I didn't just buy a piece of waterfront property, I bought a part of the community that you all depend on." I could see a few heads start to nod as I spoke. Some of the people in the crowd were beginning to understand what I was saying. I took a breath, trying to steady myself. The marina isn't just about my pier or my fishing boat. It's about businesses that rely on the infrastructure here, fishing fleets, charter services, and even the Coast Guard's training exercises. These aren't just hobbies. These are legitimate commercial operations that serve this entire harbor. And when you try to tear down my pier, you're not just affecting me. You're affecting every single person who works here, every single person who relies on this marina to survive. Your threats to shut it down are not just unjust, they're illegal. I could see Serafina's expression change. It wasn't quite anger, but it was definitely something else, concern. She hadn't expected me to come at her with the facts, with the knowledge of what I had inherited. I could feel the tide turning in the room. The people who had been quietly listening were starting to realize that I wasn't just a disruptive outsider. I was someone who had inherited something much more significant, something that was as much a part of the community as their homes and lawns. Victoria Sterling, my lawyer, stood up next to me, and I could see the weight of her presence as she began to address the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice calm but authoritative. "What Mr. Kensington is describing is not just a misunderstanding. It's a business, one that has been operating under legitimate legal agreements for years. The marina is integrated into the local economy, and the assets it provides are protected by maritime law. The threats being made by the HOA are not only without basis, they're illegal." The room erupted into murmurs, some in shock, some in disbelief. Serafina's face turned an alarming shade of red as her lawyer began flipping through his notes, desperately trying to find something to counter Victoria's argument. But it was too late. The truth was out. The legal and economic realities of the marina were too much to ignore. And now, the HOA was caught in the crossfire of their own overreach. Serafina tried to salvage the situation, but it was clear her power was slipping. She had gambled everything on her ability to bully me into compliance, and now she was losing the support of the very people she had been trying to impress. The room had shifted. The once hostile faces were now starting to soften, the tension lifting. The community wasn't ready to tear down the marina they had been relying on for decades, not for the sake of one woman's need for control. I stood tall, not because I was sure of the outcome, but because I had done what I came to do. I had fought for the truth, not just for myself, but for everyone who relied on this place. And in that moment, I realized something important. Sometimes the best way to fight back is to reveal the truth. The tension in the room could have been cut with a knife. Serafina, once the confident leader of the HOA, was now standing at the front of the community center, her posture rigid, her face flushed with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. The carefully constructed narrative she had so confidently laid out only moments earlier was crumbling before her eyes. I could see it in the way her hand gripped the edge of the podium, the way her eyes flicked nervously to her hired attorney, who was now shuffling through his papers with increasing desperation. Victoria Sterling's presence had changed the entire atmosphere of the meeting. She was calm, poised, and absolutely unflappable. As she spoke, it became clear to everyone in the room that the HOA's legal position was a house of cards ready to fall. The truth was out, and Serafina's carefully maintained grip on the community was slipping away. She had tried to frame me as the villain, the outsider trying to ruin everything they had built. But the reality was far different. I wasn't here to destroy anything. I was here to preserve something that had been a part of this harbor for decades. And now, with the legal facts on our side, Serafina's threats were revealed for what they truly were, empty posturing. Victoria continued, laying out the legal realities of the situation with an authority that left no room for doubt. "As we've shown," she said, her voice clear and strong, "the marina operations Mr. Kensington inherited are not only vital to the local economy, they are also legally protected. The community's reliance on these services, from the fuel depot to the Coast Guard training facilities, cannot be disrupted based on a misguided interpretation of HOA bylaws." There was a collective intake of breath from the crowd, as the reality of what was at stake began to settle in. This wasn't just about a small fishing boat or an unsightly pier. This was about an established, legitimate business that had been woven into the fabric of the community. And now, Serafina was threatening to tear that down without understanding the consequences. I could see the faces of the HOA members around the room start to change, their skepticism giving way to unease. They had been played, and they knew it. Serafina tried to speak, but her voice faltered, and her words lacked the same confident authority they had just minutes before. "This is absurd," she snapped, trying to regain control. These claims are fabricated. You can't just come in here and try to change everything. This marina, this business, is disrupting our community. I won't let Mr. Kensington tear down everything we've worked for." She sounded desperate, and I could tell she knew the tide was turning against her. Her hired attorney, once standing by her side like a silent ally, had gone quiet. His eyes were darting from the legal documents in his hands to the increasingly disapproving faces of the HOA members around the room. It was clear that he, too, was realizing just how weak Serafina's case really was. And that realization was beginning to hit the rest of the room, too. I felt a rush of satisfaction as I watched the shift unfold. This wasn't about winning a battle for the pier anymore. This was about exposing Serafina's overreach, her manipulation, and the harm she had tried to impose on this community. It wasn't just me she had been trying to silence. It was every single person who relied on the marina. And now, they could all see it. She wasn't protecting the community. She was undermining it. The room erupted into a low murmur, with people turning to one another, exchanging shocked looks. Some of them had been nodding along with Serafina's narrative earlier, but now they were beginning to question what had been presented. Slowly, the energy in the room shifted from hostility toward me to disillusionment with Serafina. She was no longer the figure of authority she had once been. Now, she was the outsider, the one who had misunderstood the complexities of the situation and tried to impose her will on the entire community. One by one, a few of the older members of the HOA stood up, speaking quietly among themselves. It wasn't overt. No one stood up and outright challenged Serafina just yet, but the cracks were showing. And that was all it took. The seeds of doubt were sown, and Serafina could no longer maintain her facade of control. Finally, it was one of the longtime marina workers, a man named Captain Morrison, who stood up and addressed the room with an air of authority that only came from years of experience on the water. "I've been working with Harold Peton's marina since the early 90s, he said, his voice steady and commanding. "I've worked with a lot of people in this harbor, and I can tell you, Harold built something special here. This isn't just some hobby operation. It's a business that supports the entire community, including the fishermen, the charter captains, and yes, the Coast Guard. And what Mr. Kensington is doing is not a threat to this place. It's preserving what's already been here for years." Captain Morrison's words carried weight, not just because of his long history with the marina, but because he had the respect of the people in the room. His voice resonated with authority, and as he spoke, I could see several heads in the room nodding in agreement. They understood what was at stake now. Serafina's attempts to frame me as the villain were falling apart. As the conversation shifted, I could see Serafina growing increasingly agitated. Her face was a mixture of disbelief and frustration, and her voice became shriller as she tried to reassert her position. But the damage had been done. The room was no longer on her side. I could feel the momentum turning in my favor. The truth had come out. And then, it happened. Serafina's attempt to salvage the situation backfired completely. She made a final, desperate attempt to save face by accusing me of fabricating the entire legal argument. "This is a manipulation," she said, her voice cracking with frustration. "All of this has been fabricated to try and intimidate us. I demand to see the original documents and independent verification of these outrageous claims." But the moment she said that, it was like the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. A few of the local businesses, people I had spoken to over the weekend, stood up. They were people who knew exactly what was going on, people who had been part of the marina community for years. They knew Harold Peton, they knew the business operations, and they knew what I had inherited. One by one, the people who had supported Serafina began to speak out, calling her out on her lack of understanding. Elena Rodriguez, the manager of the marina's fuel depot, spoke up next. "We've been working with Mr. Peton's operation for over 20 years, she said, her voice firm. "The marina isn't some small-time business. It's a lifeline for the entire harbor. Mr. Kensington didn't destroy anything. He's trying to keep it going." As each of these witnesses spoke, Serafina's last bit of credibility crumbled. Her hired attorney packed up his materials, realizing the case was lost, and quietly slipped out of the room, unable to defend the indefensible. Finally, it was Victoria Sterling who delivered the final blow. She stood up with a calm and steady authority that left no room for doubt. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice echoing through the room, "I believe we have all seen the facts. Mr. Kensington is not just the owner of a waterfront cabin. He is the rightful heir to a maritime operation that has been serving this community for over 30 years. His marina operation, its business relationships, and its government contracts are legally protected, and any attempt to interfere with them not only violates his rights, it risks causing significant damage to the businesses and people who rely on it. With that, the room was silent. The once solid front of the HOA was completely fractured. Serafina's face had gone pale, her attempts to salvage her position completely undone by the truth. I turned to the room, speaking as calmly as I could manage. I never intended to disrupt anything. I'm here to preserve what's already here. But I won't stand by and let anyone destroy the operation that's been supporting this community for years. It's strange how quickly the tides can change. A few weeks ago, I was a stranger to this place, just a guy looking for some peace on the water, hoping to leave behind the burnout of my previous life. Now, here I was, standing at the heart of a battle that had, for a brief moment, seemed bigger than anything I had ever imagined. What started as an innocent desire to disconnect from the world of cryptocurrency had become a fight for something much more important: the future of a community, the preservation of a legacy, and the protection of a business that so many people depended on. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had come here looking for quiet, but I had ended up in the middle of a storm, and somehow I had emerged from it stronger. The meeting had ended in a way that left no room for doubt. Serafina, humiliated and defeated, had resigned from her position as HOA president, though she did so with as much dignity as she could muster. Her last attempt to manipulate the situation had backfired spectacularly. The community, once so firmly in her grip, had seen the truth. She wasn't protecting them. She was trying to impose her own narrow vision on everyone, regardless of the consequences. Her threats, her legal posturing, and her need to control had all unraveled in the face of reality. And now, the very people who had been supporting her were beginning to turn against her. The community didn't need her anymore. The new HOA president, Margaret Chen, was a breath of fresh air. A retired teacher who had lived in the area for decades, Margaret had a deep understanding of the community's true needs. She wasn't concerned with maintaining some idealized version of the waterfront. She was concerned with the people, the families, the businesses, and the environment that had all coexisted here for years. Margaret and I had a long conversation after the meeting, and she assured me that moving forward, the HOA would work with the marina and its operations, not against it. We agreed that a better balance needed to be struck between the interests of the residential community and the vital business that the marina represented. As I stood there, the tension from the meeting slowly ebbed away. It wasn't just the victory that felt good, it was the relief of knowing that the marina's legacy had been protected, that Harold Peton's work would continue, and that this place, this community, would stay intact. The old guard had been replaced, and the next chapter for Coastal Haven was beginning to take shape. There would still be challenges ahead, but I no longer felt like an outsider who was just trying to survive. I felt like I was a part of something that had real meaning, not just for me, but for everyone in the harbor. I walked down to the pier that afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting an orange glow over the water. There was a calm now, a quiet after the storm. My pier, stood there, solid and untouched, just as it had always been. I ran my hand along the weathered wood, feeling the pulse of the place beneath my fingers. I could hear the low hum of the fuel depot in the distance, the chatter of fishermen preparing their boats, and the laughter of families arriving for charter tours. This was the heartbeat of the community, the foundation on which everything was built. And I was now part of it, whether I had planned for it or not. The boats were returning to port, their engines cutting through the water, and I saw the familiar face of Elena Rodriguez walking down the dock toward me. She had a smile on her face, a look of quiet approval. She had been one of the people who had spoken up at the meeting, defending the marina's importance to the community, and I knew she had been relieved by the outcome. She stopped next to me, nodding at the boats coming in. "You did good, Dash," she said, her voice gruff but warm. "A lot of us were wondering how it would all play out, but you held your ground. The community's better off for it." I nodded, feeling a sense of gratitude toward Elena. She had been here for so long, and her support had been crucial. "I couldn't have done it without you and the others," I replied, feeling a sense of connection to her, to all the people who had helped me navigate this crazy ride. "I came here thinking it would be a quiet life, but I've learned that sometimes the things worth protecting are the things that keep people connected." She smiled, a slight chuckle escaping her lips. "You'll get used to it," she said. "This place isn't perfect, but it's home. And home has a way of fighting back when it's threatened." I watched as the last of the boats returned to the dock, their sails furling, the crews unloading their catch for the day. There was a sense of peace now, an unspoken understanding that the marina would continue, that the community would move forward, and that I had a part to play in it. It wasn't just about the property anymore, it was about the people, the traditions, and the future. The sunset painted the sky with colors I could hardly describe, golden hues turning to deep purples and pinks as the day drew to a close. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything that had happened begin to lift from my shoulders. This was where I belonged. Not because I had money or influence, but because I had connected with something real, something that mattered. As the evening wore on, I thought back to what I had left behind in the digital world, the endless chase for more wealth, the isolation, the disconnection. Here, standing on the pier with the boats bobbing gently against the dock and the sound of the harbor surrounding me, I realized that this was what I had been looking for all along. A place where I could be part of something greater than myself, where my efforts had real meaning. And maybe, just maybe, that was worth more than all the cryptocurrency in the world. Because the value of a community, its people, its history, and its future, was something that couldn't be measured in Bitcoin or Ethereum. It was measured in the way people supported one another, in the way they fought for what was right, and in the way they held onto their roots no matter what. I looked out over the water one last time as the sun dipped below the horizon. This was just the beginning. The community had been tested, but it had emerged stronger for it. And as for me, I wasn't just the new guy anymore. I was a part of this place, this harbor, and I wasn't going anywhere.